So in this video, what we're going to be doing is going over something called Flexbox. And it's a really powerful tool in CSS that is relatively new in terms of usage. And when I say that, it's been around for a couple years, but it's really being adopted and it's something that you should pay attention to if you're doing more on the web. But if you haven't taken a break and you're just plowing through all these videos, I'd highly recommend just pushing pause, go walk around the block or go take a break for a little while and come back, because this is a bit dense. I'm going to kind of walk you through it and spend some time going over it, but it is going to shift gears a little bit. And you can kind of pay attention to the header, and that's what we're going to start with. So if you pay attention to this, we have our name on the left and work on the right, which is our navigation inside of our header. And if you kind of look at what we have going right now, is everything's kind of stacked on top of each other, even like the image and the button and all of the text, right? So what Flexbox does is it allows us to kind of start to control how the elements align and how they look in terms of next to each other or the order, and would be considered starting to go down the road of what's called a grid inside of a website. Now, we use the grid in layout, if you've done that module for this class, where we talk about the grid. There's something very similar to that with HTML and CSS that we're not going to necessarily go through in this particular module, but if you did the last part of the Code Academy tutorials, it talks about something called Bootstrap, and it did start to talk about a grid. We're not going to go down that route for this particular set of modules. We can do a lot with Flexbox moving forward. Okay, so inside of the instructional materials, there is a Flexbox guide that's worth looking at. And I don't expect everybody to just read through this and understand everything that you're looking at. But if we, at this point in our lives, use the bare minimum of what Flexbox offers, it can do a lot for us, and obviously you can build on that moving forward. Now, there's two parts of Flexbox that we really want to pay attention to, and that's the container and the items inside of the container. Okay. Now, we kind of talked about this when we put in the header and the nav and the main and the sections and the articles and asides, the HTML5 semantic markup, right? So we have this container that's the purple, and inside of it we have nested elements or children of items that we can control, right? And so this website, I'm not going to go through all of it, but this website kind of walks through all the different things that we can do, how we can control the container and then the things inside of the container, the items. Okay, so we're going to flip into brackets and specifically talk about the header. Okay, so we'll kind of dive deep with the header and then build out the rest of the page with Flexbox as well. Okay, so the header, we want the H1. So we have header as the container, and then we have H1 as an item and a nav as an item. Okay, so essentially we're going to put these two, on the same line, if you will, or a row is what it would be called if we're using a grid. Okay, so we want to kind of do that. And at this point, we're not going to be doing a ton with our HTML. We're really just straight up doing CSS from here on out. There might be a couple things we need to adjust, but we're going to pay a lot of attention to CSS. Now, we're going to find our comment that we wrote with HTML or with CSS comments, right, with our header section, and we're going to add some CSS to make those things go next to each other. And specifically, we're going to use Flexbox. Okay, so with the header, we already have that selected. We need to add something called display and flex. Okay, so this essentially says, hey, this is our container. This is our container that's going to use Flexbox. We're going to align the items, if we spell it right, to the center. And if we flip back over to this right here, we can find align items here. So we have align items, flex start, flex end, and flex center, right? So we typed in align items on the container, so this left column here is the container, and we told it to align center. And you can kind of see that it doesn't align it like text align center, it aligns it vertically center, right? So this way, like no matter how tall we make our text for either one, they're going to be vertically aligned center, which is pretty cool. Okay, and when I say this is pretty cool, it's relatively new and used recently. Like when I say new, it's like maybe the last couple of years, but it's something that we should be taking advantage of because it gives us a lot more control. Okay, and then the last one we're going to do is the flex direction as a row. Okay, so we want this to be a row, so they kind of go next to each other. Okay, so when we do this, if we hit save, we just check out what we got going on here, right? Automatically, just by doing those 3 lines, we have them side by side, which is cool. Okay, now you'll notice that when we did the align item center, there's some issues with the alignment, but we can control that with our box model. We're not going to worry about that for this module to that detail. Module 3 is really going to go into all the little fine tuning, and this would be what I would call fine tuning. But we can control that with padding or height or whatever else we can use with the box model to get that to look right. Okay? All right, so we're going to add some more things here. So we have the container. So if you imagine the header is the container, right? Now we want to pay attention to the items themselves, okay? And when we look at the Flexbox page here, we were paying attention to the container, that's our header, and now we want to pay attention to our items, okay? All right, so we're going to type in header space H1, right? So that's our first item inside of our header container. And we can control the order. And we're going to have order be 1. And we're going to do flex grow of 1. Okay, and we're going to come back to that, but it should kind of say, it should be kind of obvious what's going on there. We're going to copy that, and right before we kind of switch to the nav, we're going to change header and change it to nav. And we're going to say the order is 2, right? So we want this to come first, this to come second, and then we'll talk a second on what flex grow does here in just a second. Okay? So let's flip back over. And now what we got going is we have one item here and one item here, right? So the order changes just what you think, right? And the flex grow essentially evenly spaces this out. And this is something that you can kind of look at here, right? We put 1 so it evenly spaces each item in the row. And we can adjust that, that this is telling us what to do here. We can adjust it as we want it. So we can jump back in here and we can play around with this. If we wanted the nav first and the name second for some reason, we can do that. We don't have to change a bunch of code around, and this is the power of Flexbox, right? So we're going to keep it at 1 and 2 though. So we have our name first, and then the navigation second. Okay. Now, so now we're going to pay attention to actually getting that work to align to the right. So right now it's kind of all aligned to the left. And there's a variety of ways of doing this, but we're going to stick with flex because if we want to scale it up later, we can, okay? And it just gives you a sense of how we can work with Flexbox too. All right, so we're going to dive deeper and make the unordered list a container and then the list item links as items. So we can kind of nest those things inside of each other, okay? So we're going to do another display flex. And we are going to justify the content at the end, right? And again, you can kind of find this here. We make it display flex, and then we're going to justify the content, and we did flex end, so that way they all line up at the end, okay? So when we do that, we can save it, jump over and take a look, and we have our name on the left, our navigation on the right, and we've done all of that with flex, right? Now, once we've done that, and this is something that we're going to run into as we do this, we got it right up against the edge, right? So it's really kind of crowded. It's not looking super great, but we do have them in the right spots, okay? So this is where we can actually add things like the box model to our header to kind of push those items in a little bit. If you think about the box model, it has margin, border, padding all around the content, right? So the content is going to be that black background, right, to the header. And then we're going to have some padding. So we can add some padding from the border to keep that black background and add some space on the left and the right, okay? So this is where we get to kind of do a little bit more with the box model itself. So what we're going to do is actually go into the header, right, because that's our black background, and we're going to say, hey, we want some padding, but on the top and the bottom we want 0, and then the left and the right we want 5%. Now we're going to come back to that a little bit later, but in module 3 we're going to talk a lot about mobile and responsive design, and percentages become a bigger deal then. But for now, when you see two numbers as part of the box model, padding in this case, the first number is the top and the bottom of the box. The second number is the left and the right. So if we save that and jump in here, now all of a sudden we got some good spacing on the left and the right. Okay? So we got things going. We got the header going. Now we're going to switch to the main section of this. So back in brackets, what we really need to think about now is this main area, okay? So we have the section with our main content area, and what we need to do is actually start to put those side by side and everything, okay? Now there's a couple things we need to do to kind of set this up. The first thing we need to do is on the main tag itself, what we want to do is add a class of home, okay? And what that's going to do is allow us to have different content sections for different pages, and we can control them differently depending on the layout we want for those different pages with our CSS, okay? And we'll actually write that so you can kind of see it. So what we want to do then is create a new section in our CSS called homepage content styles, right? And what that allows us to do then is we can really just build out what we want our homepage to look like inside of this class of home that we just wrote, okay? So what we need to do then is type out home and then the div, and that's going to become our container for Flex. So this goes around our aside and our article down at the bottom here, right? So that's going to be our container for Flex. So that's where we need to write in display Flex. And then what we're going to be doing is another Flex flow, right? And what we need is a row and no wrap, okay? So we have two columns essentially is what we want, a row that doesn't wrap or stack things on top of each other is what that's doing. Okay, so we're going to close that off. Now we're going to kind of pay attention to the article and the aside. Okay, so there's a couple things we'll do here. So we start with the class of home, and inside of home we're going to look for an article, and that article is going to have the order of 1, okay? We gotta type it correctly. So we have the order of 1. And then the last one is going to be the home article, or home, class home of aside. And this is going to have the order of 2, okay? Now what this is doing is it's going to look for the home class and then the article inside of it. And we know our article is all of our text. So we're essentially reversing the order of these, right? So we want the text to come first and the picture to come second with our button. So if we save this and check out what it looks like, we should start to see our picture on the right side and then our text on the left side, right? And they're side by side because of that row and no wrap, the flex flow thing, okay? So we got them side by side, but you notice how it's like really close on the left and really close on the right, and that's okay for the header, but if we looked at our design, these are kind of pushed in a little bit to allow some space on the left and the right. So we're going to go back up to our main content styles, and we're going to write a couple things for our main that allow that to look a little bit better. Now this is kind of getting away from Flex just a little bit, but it's still kind of our positioning and working with the sections here. So we have the background color, and what we want to do is we want to add a width of 90%. And again, this is covered more in Web 3, but this starts to set us up for the mobile layouts later on. We use percentages for that. And then we're going to say the maximum width that we want this to be is 1,000 pixels. So it'll never get bigger than 1,000 pixels, no matter how big the browser window is. And then the next thing we need to do is margin. So this is part of the box model. And 0 space auto. Now that first 0 is the top and the bottom of the margin of the box. And so we set that to 0. And then the auto is left and right. And what that does is it kind of pushes equally on the left and the right, so it's going to center this main content area. Okay? Now, it's a little bit weird, but essentially what this does is it allows you to center sections of your pages. Okay? All right, so let's save that and have a look at kind of where we're at now and see if it's looking a little bit better. Cool. Right on. So we have some space on the left and the right, and keep in mind that blue is from the live preview. But we can kind of see here, now our content is like really close right to the edge of our white box or whatever color that you're kind of working with, okay? So we want to work with that, right? And we know that we can work with margin, padding, and border as part of the box model to create space in between these areas, okay? So we're going to add one last thing into that main, and that is padding, right? So we want padding, and now here's where we're going to add 4 numbers, and the 4 numbers are essentially all 4 sides of the box. And it starts with the top, which is 35 pixels is what I'm using, and then it goes to the right, and I'm going to do 5%, and then the bottom, I'm going to add 35 pixels, and then the left, I'm going to do 5% as well. So when we save that, so we got top, right, bottom, left, right? So we can write that way, and that's totally cool. Or we could write this another way and just have the top and the bottom, right? But I'm going to keep it as 4 there, so that way you can kind of style it and you can dial in those numbers, because we're going to take a look at our preview and see if it's doing what we want it to do, okay? So yeah, so we got some space on the left, and we got some space on the right, and got some space on the top, and that's cool. And we got some space down here. So I'm going to leave that bottom number there, so that way you can adjust it later on if you want, because when we do this next part, we're going to adjust the footer. But it looks like we got the main area, content area, doing pretty well. You can dial in like some spacing here if you want to make it look a little better, but I think we got it pretty close. So for the next part, what we're going to be working with is the footer, right? So when we go down to the footer, we got all this stuff down here with an unordered list and our social media links and everything. And so we're going to add in some styling to first get the unordered list to actually look okay, and then work with the flex to do what we want it to do. So after the homepage content styles, I'm going to add another comment in here and call it footer styles, right? So we can kind of find this stuff later. Now, you'll notice that we have a footer tag, so we want to select that. And what we're going to do is we're going to text align center, and that's going to align everything inside of the footer, the text that way, and that's what we want. And then we are going to just leave the footer like that for now. Okay. The next thing we need to do is pay attention to the unordered list that we have. So again, we're going to select that. So every unordered list inside of footer, we are going to do a couple things, right? So we are going to do the list style type and set it to none, just like what we've done in the past. So that gets rid of bullets. And we're going to do the margin and set it to 0. And we're going to do the padding and set it to 0. And this is going to take away that kind of indent that happens with unordered lists. And when we look at that, we can kind of check out what that does, right? So we have everything centered, and we take away the bullets, and it's all nice aligned in the center as well. Okay, so we're getting closer to what we want. Okay. The next thing we need to do is add in the flex part, because right now everything is kind of stacked on top of each other. So we're going to use the unordered list as our container, and we can use the list items as our items, but we should be good with just the container. So we're going to do display flex, and then we're going to have flex flow, just like we did earlier, as row. And we're going to have this actually wrap, because we don't mind if this stacks on top of each other if the web page gets smaller. And then the last thing we're going to do is justify the content and have it be centered. And we can save that and hop over here and kind of check out that, hey, we got these lined up, and that's good, but they're really close to each other. So how can we control that, right? We were working on the unordered list level, and so if we add padding or margin, it's just going to add space around the entire thing. So we want to dive in one level further and actually select the links that are inside of the unordered list. Okay, so we're going to select the footer and then find all the unordered lists inside the footer and then select the links. And here's where we can put padding of 0 and 0.5 ems. And you can pick whatever you think looks good. But again, this is the top and bottom, and this is the left and the right from the box model, right? So if we look at this, what we got going here, we have the page, looking pretty much like how we want it to look. We have some spacing here. We have all of our columns kind of working out. And we have the heading working out. There's some spacing issues that you can go back through and kind of fix using the box model to make it look like how you would like to have it. But we can work on those spacing issues along the way. So building out this before you kind of move forward is important because you want to have the setup going. Now, if you really get into this, a lot of times we use what's called a grid in CSS, like I mentioned, so a lot like layout and things like that moving forward. But Flexbox allows us to do a lot of things with layout, spacing, alignment, and the order, which is super huge kind of moving forward. And I think we've kind of scratched the surface of what you can do, but a lot of what we've talked about gives you the foundation to kind of dig in a little bit more if you really get into this.